Good morning and welcome to Brighter Morning with Bhoe. You are watching MCTV, Multicultural TV, and you are listening to 97.5 FM radio, hot like pepper, multicultural radio. And this is Brighter Morning with Bhoe. You just heard the news from Chanel there, and you would have heard that we have crossed 1,000 deaths in Trinidad and Tobago. That is not something to be ignored. Even as we vaccinate, the death toll is increasing, and what 1,000 deaths mean is that you have 1,000 families and 1,000 extended families and a whole circle of friends that have been affected by the loss of each individual, okay? We have mass vaccination taking place in Trinidad and Tobago, and there are two strategies, it seems, being employed by the government. One is to address sectors like the supermarkets association, construction, business, etc., and the second one is to address communities, and those are being done through the health centers. So I wonder if we can pull a clip now that will show us what is happening at one of the mass vaccination sites. Could we pull that?
The drive-through mass vaccination site at the Atterbolden Stadium was set up within 5 days. Director of Corporate and Shared Services for Proman Limited, Christian Ramdeen, said it came following a call from the Ministry of Health.
To do that, we came up with an idea of having a hybrid system, which is to have a drive-through model, which is not novel, but not widely used in Trinidad, together with a walk-in clinic if that system becomes optimized or maximized, rather. So what we did was we catered for a system that will tolerate about 1,000 persons per day. And what we've seen thus far, at least today, we're almost at that point in time and we're almost out of vaccines.
Ramdeen said the system is designed to assist 1,000 people per day. He said they intend to go for at least 2 weeks in the administration of the first dose of the COVID-19 vaccine.
And then when the 21-day cycle begins, we'll resume another 2 weeks. But if the ministry asks us to go further than that, that's something we would definitely consider. With respect to capacity, daily throughput, just to go back on that, we will be actually doing 7 days, so we're not cutting off on Friday. We are going to be running Monday through Sunday with this exercise. With respect to throughput, we have currently four bays running at this time, at least drive-through, and we comfortably, without a blink, could have handled 1,000 persons per day.
Ramdeen added if the subscription picks up, they can increase their capacity to up to 1,500 per day. And Medical Director of TriCare Medical Center, Dr. Shiraz Mohammed, said this was the second day of the drive-through experience. He said thus far, it has been a bit of a learning experience, but the team is now well-oiled and running.
Thus far, we have no complications today to note, and the turnover time from patient triage to discharge is about 30 minutes. So I would say that we're moving with adequate pace as of now.
There are various sites at this location. There is the vaccination site. 24 people are at this location for triage, screening and administration of vaccines. There are 2 teams at the observation site. There are also teams dedicated in the eventuality of anything going wrong.
Welcome back. Well, you saw that mass vaccination taking place on a drive-through system at the Atterbolden Stadium. And you saw Mr. Ramdeen there. He works with a major methanol company in Trinidad and Tobago. And you see the private sector very much involved in this. I think everybody is committed to getting this mass vaccination drive completed because they understand the significance to the protection of health in Trinidad and Tobago. The other national story we had was the issue of the Media Association responding to the decision by the minister responsible for communication to give exclusive access to one television station, TTT, for a particular event, which was the remigration of Venezuelans back to their homeland in Trinidad and Tobago to Venezuela. And the Media Association is objecting to that because they are objecting to the principle of not having a free media in Trinidad and Tobago and to have selected access by the government of giving media opportunities on command, so to speak. The position in support of that, you might say, was articulated also by the leader of the opposition, Mrs. Kamala Prasad Bisesa, who accused the government of using their power dictatorially to censure and to prevent the media from doing its work. Now, this is a story we are likely to follow. Let's see how it develops. My advice to the Minister for Communication is you made a mistake, and I think you should resile from that mistake. The media is a free media in Trinidad and Tobago. And once government starts determining which media can do this and which one can't do this, we will have a problem. So it's not wise. It's not a wise policy to pursue. If you want TTT to have opportunity, what you have to do is to allow that institution to do the kind of programming that would meet the requirements of the market and would create value in the community and allow it to assert itself in the market. You cannot do it by executive fiat. Worldwide, we have a raging virus, of course, the Delta variant and the Delta Plus variant now, which is taking place. Some countries are being devastated in Asia. I mean, people are just dying in their homes, infecting one another. And in Myanmar, things are out of control. As you know, you have a military coup in that country, and the military has taken over. The military in Myanmar is a hell of a military because they control everything. They control the military process. They control the military arms of the state. They carry out the law. They own businesses, all these generals and senior officials in the military. They determine political power because they wield so much themselves. And in that situation, which is basically like having a country under conditions of state of emergency, you have the politicians with little power in the system now that the military has taken over. The duly elected prime minister, I think, is not able to function. And the people have been rebelling since the military takeover. But now the COVID has just about made it impossible for any kind of protest to take place. So we have a serious situation there. We saw a little while ago floods in China. Floods in Europe, in Belgium and in Germany in particular. 195 people, I think, died during those floods. And we are seeing now flood in China as well. There were some terrible pictures there from China in which the people in China were very well prepared for the rains. So they had their raincoats, they had their umbrellas, etc., to brave the rains. But what they were not prepared for was these terrible floods. and you saw literally scores of cars floating in the flood. They were submerged under the water. And you saw people with water up to under their arms, really. You saw trains with water basically covering the seats, coming through the windows of the trains because the subway had been flooded. So you have a horrible situation there in China, and there is likely to be more and more casualties there. It's a very difficult thing to address. And that brings us to the big issue of climate change. Now, we are going to have some guests here tomorrow. We will have Professor, I'll tell you her name in a minute, Judith Gobin. And we will begin the discussions with her tomorrow about the oceans and the environment and sustainable management of the oceans and what climate is doing to the oceans and so on. But next week, we are going to continue the discussions with two very important experts on this, one local but internationally involved, and the other one international but is a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago. So we will continue this discussion on climate change because it's going to be a big issue. It's affecting the weather, it's affecting the storm patterns, it's affecting the raging fires, it's affecting flood, it's causing havoc all over the world, and we've got to have a sense of what the implications are for a place like Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean region, which is a place surrounded by water. Okay? The other thing that I want to mention before we go on to our guests is the flight by Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon. And he basically took a flight into outer space with a number of people, his brother, another young person who is the youngest person to ever take flight of this kind, and then an older female astronaut who got the chance to go and who said that she'd be happy to go again. The flight that was not long. It took all of 10 minutes to go and return. But it got into outer space and they were able to float. Now, an important issue is emerging here on this. But before I do that, I want to say that Bezos, on the same day that he took that flight, he also gave $200 million US in charity to two important organizations led by fairly well-known personalities in the United States. And both of those happen to be organizations that deal with poverty and hunger and basically the management of relations between communities in order to achieve things. So we are looking at the launch now. So let's look at that.
Go, Jeff. Go, Mark. Go, Wally. Go, Oliver. You are going to space. Oh my goodness, listen to the roar of the BE3 engine. We are just about to pass through max Q, maximum dynamic pressure. That is when the stresses on the vehicle are at their maximum.
Max Q.
Max Q is confirmed. Beautiful burn on that BE3 engine. Liquid hydrogen.
Mach 1.
and liquid oxygen as the propellant. It's a nice, not just clean in terms of beautifully performing, but what comes out of it, it's steam, right? Whew. To see the glow of the engine underneath the rocket, just under our shoulders, and to know that we've got a crew that is going to space, it just feels different, doesn't it, Gary?
It is totally different. We're going to get spectacular views here, and you're going to get the engineering expertise, of course, as well, from Blue Origin's own mission control.
Unreal.
First status check.
We don't have the video of that just yet, Tom, but we can.
Thank you very much for watching. Welcome to Brighter Morning on MCTV, Multicultural TV, and new 97.5 radio. Thank you for listening and for watching and for staying with us. So I was talking about Jeff Bezos and what he did. You see, that beautiful flight into outer space, but he also gave $200 million to charity, and he also gave another $200 million some days before to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, which is a place, basically a large museum of important things in the world having to do with not just science, but basically it houses a number of areas that a person can go, and you spend a half day there, you can get a decent education by simply looking at some of the displays. It's a significant institution. The Smithsonian is a place also that also supports scholars to do work that use the institution there. So he's given charity on the one hand, and he's using his money to do this, to fly into space. And the real problem that is emerging is, should these very wealthy people try to create a space tourism program which has implications for pollution of the atmosphere and impact on climate change, and really represent leisure travel and represent a new tourism product? Or should that money be used for charitable purposes? And I think by doing what he is doing, and I think Bezos is basically saying that you can do both. You have to do both. And you have to explore space because it is important. And you also have to give charity because you have to look at what is happening at the human population as well. Well, this is Brighter Morning with Bhoe, and we are on U97.5 radio. You are listening to us, and you can watch us on MCTV, Multicultural TV. And we are very happy that you are watching. This is a station committed to local programming and regional programming. And as time evolves, you will see how this station is very, very different to anything that we have at the present time in Trinidad and Tobago. We have a phone call. Okay, so my guest is on. And I want to invite her now so that we can see her on video. And this lady is a lady of some significance in the world of law. She is the dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of the West Indies. And she is very, very well qualified academically. I won't go into that. But she is also, I would say, one of these outspoken scholars who is confident enough of what she says because of how well she knows the law to come out and speak in the public domain. And these kinds of scholars are very important because they do their work deeply and properly, but they are also public intellectuals because they inform the discussion and debate about important issues in society that affect the ordinary citizen. And therefore, I want to welcome this morning Professor Rosemary Belle Antoine so that we can have a conversation. How are you going?
Good morning, Bhoe. I'm very well, thank you. I'm quite fine. And I should say that I think it's the duty of the intellectual, a certain one from UV in the region, to speak out on its issues.
Yes, of course. I've always held that view, and I'm glad you hold that view too, because without informed people speaking out on issues, we are going to be lost.
Yes.
So I want to start by asking you, I mean, there is an issue emerging here because of COVID, and it's a worldwide issue, but it is becoming a prominent issue here now in Trinidad and Tobago. Right now, the government is proceeding on a mass vaccination drive, and the private sector is involved. And the government is seeking to persuade people to get vaccinated. The private sector is seeking to persuade people to get vaccinated. But there is some hesitancy to vaccination, and there is some resistance to vaccination. And this needs to be resolved. So I would ask you, without getting into the heart of the issue yet, if you would simply comment briefly on what is emerging here and elsewhere, but more particularly what is emerging in the Caribbean.
So I think it is correct that we should persuade and we should educate. I don't think there's ever been a time in our history when there have been so many conspiracy theories and so much information and misinformation. And of course, that has to do with social media. So we do live in extraordinary times. And across the Caribbean and Trinidad, we do have a degree of hesitancy, anti-vaxxers, as they're called. Sometimes in surprising quarters, it's not just ignorant people as we like to believe. They are very well-educated people who are distrustful. And in some parts of the world, there are good reasons for that distrust, as in America, the experiments and so forth. Here, I don't think it's that particularly, but just a fear. And so I do think there's a fair amount. I know that in relation to the health sector, there's a percentage there too, which is a bit surprising. And in some countries worse than others. I don't think Trinidad is among the worst. I know St. Vincent has a huge problem, from what I can tell. So we have to, yes, continue to persuade and educate, but at the same time, this pandemic is not waiting on anyone. So if we can't persuade, or can we persuade at a fast enough rate, because every day we know variants are emerging and so on. So there is a sense of urgency. But at the same time, I'm not one of those who would laugh or get upset at persons who are afraid of the vaccine or who have whatever reasons to not take the vaccine. It's just that I do think there's a limit in this whole question of waiting to see and persuade and educate.
Okay, you mentioned St. Vincent. I mean, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent has taken a position that basically I would like to see everybody vaccinated. But if you choose not to be vaccinated, I'm not going to force you. But between the government and the private sector where you work, you are going to have to take your tests every week, and you're going to have to pay for it. What do you think of that kind of approach?
Well, actually, that was one of the positions that I put forward recently when we had a session at the bar. the Commonwealth and OECS Bar Association. And what I was saying is that even if we don't do so-called forcing mandatory, the fact is that there's what I would call soft law or indirect ways of essentially getting people to take the vaccine, which is what happens today. With the yellow fever is the example I gave. No, we've never had a law that told you that you had to go and get a yellow fever vaccine. But if you want to travel, certainly if you're from Trinidad, because we were on the WHO list for yellow fever or PAHO list, whenever you wanted to travel, you had to get the yellow fever. I had to go and get another one, although I had one as a child. So indirectly, you are forced or you are compelled to do it. In the case of the tests, it was one of the ways that I suggested instead of firing people, because I believe that's a very important issue, the consequences if there's a compulsion. And, it is reasonable to say, okay, you don't wish to take it for whatever reason, but you have to ensure or prove that, in fact, you are COVID-free, so you're not a risk to others. So I think it's a reasonable position to take.
Yeah, I think of all the countries in the industrialized world, I think President Macron in France has taken perhaps his strongest position, which is that basically he said, look, we are not going to put you in jail for not taking the vaccine, but if you want to travel on the train, you have to prove that you have a vaccine. If you want to go to a restaurant, you have to prove that you have a vaccine. What you think of that kind of situation? Because some people think that that is really sort of forcing, and more than that, kind of shaming. So what about your perspective on that? I will get to the law in a minute, but I just wanted to examine these issues.
It is indirect lawmaking, it is compulsion indirectly, or what I might call soft law. But I don't think it's an accident that the countries that you are seeing with the sort of the most draconian positions thus far, or the most forceful positions, France, St. Vincent in the Caribbean, are those countries where there's a high percentage of persons who are anti-vaxxers, who are who don't wish to take the vaccine. I mean, France was out of Europe, for some reason, had a greater percentage than the others. Right, and similarly in St. Vincent, we don't know the reasons. So it's not a surprise to me that they would be first out of the box to say, look, we need to do something. We can't just rely on persuasion. We can't rely on education. We must take a more forceful approach. It's not a surprise.
Okay, so at the heart of this thing is the human rights issue, and on the other side is the social or societal protection issue. Tell me how the Constitution and the law in Trinidad and Tobago, and you can use examples from the Caribbean as well, how the Constitution and the law affects how we look at this issue of human rights and social or societal protection in the context of a health pandemic.
Well, I mean, first I would say it's not just a human rights issue, but though many people instinctively think of it as human rights. Yes, human rights is an important dimension. But when it comes to the private sphere, the employment workplace, which is actually the biggest issue today, really is not a question of human rights. People use that term loosely, and that's simply because human rights doesn't apply in that particular sphere. Yeah, it would be labor law, and in some ways administrative law if you're talking about universities, for instance, because that's also an issue. Are you going to compel university students to go back? We had a case just yesterday where it was ruled that actually came. I was so excited, it happened just before this interview, and I'll tell you about it later. But yes, so it's a whole host of legal principles, from labor law, from administrative law, and even tort, harm and all of that. But in terms of the Constitution and human rights, certainly if you're thinking about putting forward a law that applies to everyone, yes, the human rights dimension would come into play. Or if the state were to make decisions about its own workers, human rights would come into play and the Constitution. And in all of the constitutions in the region, I have suggested, and I think it's pretty clear actually, that yes, a serious pandemic and a serious health risk, such as what we are seeing now, will meet the test. It will meet the test of a presumption of constitutionality or a reasonable limitation on our rights. Because all of our constitutions protect our rights, but on the other hand, as we know, its rights are not absolute. So there are particular tests or ways of measuring whether, if you are going to limit rights, whether it is reasonable. In our case, it can't not, it as you are permitted to limit rights or abrogate rights unless it is reasonably justifiable. So that reasonable justifiable test. And in other countries, the notion of reasonableness as well. They're different language, but reasonableness comes into it. But interestingly, in other parts of the Caribbean, not in Trinidad and Tobago, in terms of the strict written law, you actually have public health and you actually have infectious diseases written into the constitutions as examples or as grounds to limit rights. So it's really fairly clear that a situation like this, it would be permissible to limit rights in the public interest.
Okay, now, I mean, most societies end up in litigious situations over issues like this where people feel strongly. But in the context of taking a matter to a court of law, what is the difference between a court using the Constitution and the law to rule for or against a citizen in relation to the state, and for or against a citizen in relation, let's say, to a company or his employer?
When you say the different, what do you mean the different?
Is there a difference in the way the court would look at the issue? Let's say a person were a public servant or a person were a private sector employee?
Not really. I mean, we all come before the courts equally. But what I would say that when you are entering into the realm of constitutional law and human rights, I mean, when we say fundamental, it's not an accident that we say fundamental, so that the Constitution is the highest law of the land. And also in our court system, when it's a constitutional matter, such as one with human rights, you do get, or you should get, a quicker trial and so forth because of that reason. I say should because that's what it always happens. And you also have rights of appeal. People always think, you have a right of appeal. You actually don't. There are very few instances where you have that right. But if it's a constitutional matter, yes, that would be the case. But in terms of how your case is handled, etc., no, there's not much difference in relation to that. But certainly with the Constitution, once you rule on a human rights principle, it is of great importance, public importance, and of general application for sure.
Okay, you were mentioning something that happened in the United States yesterday that you felt was important, predating our conversation today. Would you like to share that with us?
Yes, sure. So, I mean, obviously, a few months now I've been writing on this issue and basically saying that I feel, whatever my personal view, because obviously this is not personal to me. I myself had my concerns about vaccines and so forth, especially, recently. But from a law point of view and doing the analysis and so, I had felt that courts would indeed meet those thresholds easily. They would find it reasonable in terms of human rights and the Constitution for there to be compulsion in terms of vaccines. And also I felt in terms of the private sphere, labor, employers, etc., and universities, that similarly they would find it reasonable for the employers and universities to have these requirements in place because of the context of the COVID, how dangerous it has been, etc. And of course, some people feel you can't force and you can't force. Well, we've had a couple of decisions from the United States. The one that happened yesterday had to do with universities. And in Virginia, and as you mentioned, we love litigation. So almost 600 universities in the U.S. have required students to take a vaccine before returning. And something I felt certainly our medical interns had to do if we work in a hospital. That is always in my view. But it was ruled yesterday that it was indeed lawful for the universities to be able to do that. So they upheld that requirement. So they were sued by some of the students. The students actually raised the experimental nature of the vaccine. The other case talked about that too. At the court, it was not sufficient for the court in terms of what was necessary in that particular context. So I think that's a clear indication. The trend that I've been observing, not just with the vaccines, but generally with this pandemic, the trend has been, and it is not surprising, that individual rights have had to be sacrificed, I suppose you can say,
Yes.
in terms of the collective rights or the public interest, the greater good. That has been the trend. The other example I can give would be the closure of borders all over the world. So in Trinidad and Tobago, I found it personally. I had great concern and angst over all of our nationals being shut abroad. But at the same time, I was not surprised when the courts did not uphold those challenges, because in each case, the trend has been not your individual right, but the rights of the
collective good. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I want to quote something from you here, because I think you were clear on this from the beginning and very long ago, relatively, because you did something, I think, at the Caribbean Commonwealth Law Association, and you said that compulsory, I'm quoting from you now, compulsory requirement for the COVID-19 vaccine is justifiable in law, and you went on to observe that it is also so under the Constitution, and you said in the private sector. So I think you saw this very early. You had no lack of clarity at all in interpreting the law. You had no lack of clarity in taking the constitutions into account. You had no lack of clarity in balancing individual rights, and I know that you're very strong on that, with collective rights or collective responsibility or collective good. And at the end of the day, I mean, life is hard, life can be difficult, but you have to make hard choices.
Yes.
And you are saying that in a democracy where reasonableness should prevail, that clarity does exist for the interpretation of the law, the Constitution, and actual decision making that leads to the management and practice of good behavior to allow for the society to move forward.
Yes, exactly. I mean, and yes, of course, and that's a very good layman's perspective. And I always say law is common sense. At least that's how I see law.
Yeah.
It's about practical solutions. And on your show, or was it your show? But anyway, I heard the Prime Minister saying, I think it was on your show first, you're saying, well, not now, but if the situation gets worse, we may have to take a choice. Right now, it might not be so necessary. And that is also what I've been saying from a law perspective. So although I'm very clear, and so I agree with the Prime Minister on that in particular, although I am clear that there's legal justification, what I've also said is that something can be valid in law, it doesn't mean that it is desirable, especially at this point in time. But you want to know that if you have to go that route, that it is legitimate in the eyes of the law. So I do consider the industrial relations and the social, as you mentioned before, implications. And when on your program, Prime Minister was talking about, well, we are looking at it and maybe this is how things go, etc. That's what I would call, and I've discussed what that really is the principle of proportionality.
Yes.
So I've talked about reasonableness, but then there's also this other principle. Is it sufficient? Is the context sufficiently grave to take that other step at this point in time? Is there another route that we can take to solve the same problem? And so we have to satisfy ourselves that we have explored all other possibilities before we take the step of abrogating or limiting human rights. And you're right, I'm a human rights lawyer, so you usually see me here saying human rights,
yes,
human
of
rights,
course.
human rights.
So I would say that normally in any situation, I mean, a person like you and a professional like you in the law would basically take the human rights position.
Yes.
But you see the reasonableness of the containment of that position in relation to the public good. Is that correct?
Yes. Although I would say yes and no, because yes, I am a human rights advocate, a human rights lawyer, etc. But human rights, I think people have a sort of a mistaken view of human rights or of the law actually sometimes, in the sense that I was saying yesterday to another colleague, just a few years ago I gave a talk on human rights for the American Commission. I think it was 2013. It was in Trinidad and Tobago. And my topic was about apathy towards human rights. And people didn't seem to care about it. It was this human rights thing. It was only death penalty. That's all they knew about.
When people get in trouble, they worry.
But now there's been a huge shift, which I am grateful for. People are very conscious about human rights. And in fact, we've gone the other end of the scale where everything is supposedly a violation of human rights. But human rights really isn't. It isn't quite like that. That's one. I mean, there are particular examples. Of course, it's all encompassing in some ways. But the other thing I would say, part of human rights discourse and part of this whole notion of what is a human right is taken into account the balance. Because we don't live in isolation, no man is an island. So there's always a human rights law. This balancing of rights, your right, my right, group rights, individual rights. So it's not unusual. Yeah, it's not that I would just do whatever I want to do and that's my human right. No, that's not how it is.
All right, we'll explore that a little bit because I think you've raised something important there that is more than Trinidad and Tobago. But I just want to ask you, and you need not, you can just be crisp in your answer on this. As this variant evolves and it creates a situation that is really horrendous, it can be horrendous. We hope that everything will be fine in Trinidad and Tobago. But we could have a situation, for instance, where the Caribbean is overrun by this thing, as indeed is happening in many Asian countries now, as indeed it's happening. This morning I saw 83% of the new infections in the United States, all unvaccinated people, almost 100% with unvaccinated people, is of the variant and variant plus. This what you call it, Delta variant and the Delta variant plus. And if we got to a situation where things were horribly out of control, would the laws that govern our country and the Constitution allow us to deal with that, or would we have to go to the Parliament to pass new laws?
Well, you mean deal with that? You mean just we require people to be vaccinated?
Yes, because I get the feeling you're saying, look, let's be reasonable in this and let's not become authoritarian about it and so on. Let's just get the job done, which is kind of my view. I mean, you don't want to. I am totally against authoritarian systems. But if you got to a situation where the whole society were threatened, do the laws allow us or allow a government and a society to act, or do we need to go for more laws? Because, I don't want to condition what you're saying, because I would have expressed my personal preference, but I don't want to do that.
I understand. So, first, my position actually at this point is that there are categories of workers that you can today require to have a vaccine. These are high risk. That's my view at the moment. I don't know that we've got to the point where every worker, but that's my personal view. But certainly for like healthcare workers and really high risk workers, I think they should be required to take a vaccine. And if they can't take a vaccine or don't wish to take a vaccine, they must provide a test, as I explained, or you isolate them, homework, etc., etc. Now, can we, in terms of other people, have a law or do the laws prevent us? No, there's no law that prevents us. It was one of the misconceptions in the beginning. Oh, well, there's no mandatory laws for employers and this one can't require you to. That is completely false. And it's a misunderstanding of what law is. We do not act only if there's a law, do we? We don't need a law to tell us to do A, B, C, and D. The law generally comes in to prescribe something where there's something that has gone wrong or mischief. Most laws, almost all laws, most laws are there to correct a wrong or mischief. So for many things, there's a particular law. There's no law that tells an employer that you must choose the person who's best qualified for your job. No, the employer makes those decisions. Yeah. So at this point in time, a university, an employer, even somebody in a condominium who owns condominiums can say, in order for you to work in my place, in order for you to come to university, in order for you to live in my house, you must take a vaccine. There's no law that prevents you, so you're free to do it.
Yes.
And somebody is also free to challenge you in court.
Yes.
That's the thing. So there's no restriction really, except reasonableness. Yes.
Well, I'm going to extricate two answers from you in summary form. One is that we don't really need any new law. We do not need to legislate for this. And secondly, you are saying that any individual or private sector institution can make their own rules about this from the point of view of self-protection or protection of others. And you are free to challenge that in court, but that decision can be made.
Yes, it can be. It can be, and it is, and has been already from the very beginning. Yes. So there's a vacuum of the law. Now I think that where the law is silent, you can act. I think, however, that most people, most employers, most ordinary people, and most people, I think, would prefer if the state would write a law and tell them what to do, right? But I don't know that they would or they wouldn't as the case, or even a policy, because people know it's a controversial issue and they don't want to have to take these decisions and it's unclear. But some people were thinking that they needed to have this law, but as I said, that's not the case. But having said that, in the absence of a policy or a law, and once you make a law, by the way, that can also be tested, of course. If the government makes a law, the state makes a law tomorrow, yes, somebody can challenge a law too, constitutionally, as I've said. But they would prefer to have that clarity, because other than that, the employer would have to defend his or her action, or the university would have to defend his or her action in a court to say that this was warranted, this was reasonable. In the case of the worker and the employment sphere, we have other rules, labor law rules, which we would use. So, for example, we would have to talk about, and this has already been raised, terms and conditions of employment, would they breach those, for instance? Yeah, because there's a point of view out there that it would violate the unilateral change of your terms and conditions. I have also disagreed with that.
Yes.
Because one, yes, it was not present. Nobody had it written into their contract that you have to take a vaccine if there's a COVID pandemic. Nobody had that. But several things. One is that there are exceptional situations where terms and conditions can be changed unilaterally, and this would probably fit one of those exceptional ones. But more importantly, there's a competing term and condition.
Yes.
And that is the implied term, contractual term, and employer to have a safe and healthy workplace. So it's a question of It's not a question of one. In fact, that is probably more important because it's also statute-based, health
That's
and
right.
safety. Yeah.
Okay, well, I've got to close it up now because we're at the top of the hour and we've got to go to the news. I want to thank you for a very, very sober and enlightening discussion, bringing light to all the heat around us, and I'm grateful for that. And there are some constitutional issues that have to do with the exertion of power during the pandemic by governments all over the world that I would like to explore with you. And if you will agree on another occasion, I will have you come and we can talk about that. But thank you very much. And we now break for the news with Chanel. This is Brighter Morning with Bhoe.
Thank you for having me. You have a great day.
You're welcome.